Haboim, welcome everyone. We're about to begin Be'ezras Hashem together on Daf Yud Gim Amud Aleph, starting with Daf Yud Beis Amud Beis, 7 lines from the bottom. The Mishnah states the opinion of Rabbi Elazar in the Seif of the Mishnah. Unlike Rabbi Eliezer beforehand said that Stam Hekdesh goes to Bedek Habayis. This opinion of Rabbi Elazar, in contrast, really holds like Rabbi Yoshua in the sense that when he's Makdish Nechosov, then the Stam Hekdesh goes to the Mizbeach. And therefore the Mishnah states, when one is Makdish, those things like Yayin, like flour, like birds, those things go to the Mizbeach. The only problem is, since one cannot just offer those things on the Mizbeach alone, you can't offer flour on the Mizbeach alone without a carbon. Therefore, they have to be sold to somebody who will then use it for those things that are brought on the Mizbeach as a menachos or nesachim. And even the oifos have to be sold so they can bring then the proceeds to buy an oila of a behema. So that's how Rabbi Elazar learned that all of these things are sold for somebody to bring a carbon. The proceeds are then used to buy a carbon oila of a behema, not good enough to have an oila of an oif. The Gemara now explains the position. Rabbi Elazar says the Gemara, quoting the Mishnah, Rabbi Elazar Omer Yemachru v'chulei. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Abohu b'shem Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. Taima de Rabbi Elazar. What is the reason for Rabbi Elazar that says that everything that is sold ultimately needs to be used for a carbon oil of a behema? Says the Gemara, bring the following pasuk we saw before. Daber el Aharon ve'el bonav v'goymer. Speak to Aaron and his children. Asher yakrivu la Hashem la'oila. That they shall bring a carbon la Hashem. It should be an oila. Hakol, Gemara understands, korev oila. Without the specifications, then everything is brought as a carbon oila. Liritzoincham tomim zochar. The pasuk next states, Liritzoincham tomim zochar. Yochal afilu oifos. I might think even when it comes to birds. Tamulomer bebokar v'lo beoifos. Therefore it says, no, you can't bring the oif as an oila. It requires to be a bakar, an animal oila. Rabbi Yirmiyahu, Rabbi Bun, Bar Chia, having Yosivun v'amrin Tamon Amar Rabbi Yochanan. They were sitting together, and they said over there, Rabbi Yochanan said, Taimud Rabbi Shimon, Shekain Nekeva, Sheba'oif Ksheira Lavoi La'oila. Rabbi said, and then Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Yochanan explained that the nekeva can be brought as an oif, as an oila of an oif. And therefore, since it can be brought as a korban as an oif, therefore as a kedushas guf, whereby you cannot sell it unless it gets a mum. Uvacho omar hochin. But over here, Rabbi Elazar says you could sell the oif. So here we have l'chara contradiction. Since the oif can be brought as an oila, so we said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, b'shem Rabbi Shimon, therefore it has kedushas guf, and it cannot be sold unless it gets a mum. Yet over here, Rabbi Elazar in our Mishnah says you should sell the oif, take the proceeds to buy the carbon oil of a behema. Top of Gimam at Aleph. Rabbi Yosi kiyamte keho. We can establish Rabbi Elazar like the following statement: Domar b'Shmuel bar Shem Rabbi Zeira, Kol she'ena yechol likarev loihi v'loi dameho loikot she'ela hekdesh dom. If something that is going to be offered that cannot be used on the altar, he wants to offer on the mizbech, but it won't be able to be possible to be used, and is dameh either. Therefore, it has the kedusha of mammon, kedusha's damim. That amris yeyus, and therefore it comes out that you, Rabbi Elazar, said very well, correctly. Lahakrivoy Ein ato yochel dichsiv. You can't be makriv because it says babokar, as we learned in the previous drasha, v'loy be'oifos, and it can't be a carbon oila of an oif. Liftoisoi ein at yochel. You also can't be paid and redeem it because she'ein oif pidyon. It doesn't have a pidyon. So therefore, Rabbi Elazar is correct by saying it's sold. Then the proceeds is used to buy a carbon oila behema. Lefun came because of this. Sorich meimar loy kitche ella kedushas damim. Therefore, wasn't niskadesh ella with the kedushas of damim. So that supports Rabbi Elazar shita in our Mishnah. Now the Gemara goes back to the brisa that was quoted on Amud Beis. What did the brisa say? The brisa said when the person was mafrish, he was mafrish a nekeva. So the brisa stated three different opinions. It stated in regards to tmura, according to the first opinion of the Tanakama, it stated that if he's mafrish the nekeva for the oila, his oila, or his pesach, or his asham, then it's going to be valid as a tmura. And we said the concept of tmura is such that the animal has to have kedusha as guf to then exchange the kedusha from that kedusha of the animal, and then also bring it onto the other animal. The classic example we said is that if you have a carbon oila, it has a kedusha guf as a kedusha for the mizbeach, then you bring a animal that is chulin, and you want to be then make a tmura, which is incorrect. You're not allowed to do so, but if you did, the din is that the kedusha of this oila not only remains on the oila, but also becomes kedusha's oila on the chulin animal. That's called tmura. So according to Tanakama, when you do that and you're mafrish a nekeva, that nekeva you can say tmura, even though you can say tmura for all of these types of korbanos, whether it's an oila, a pesach, or an osham. The second opinion, the brisa, is the opinion of the Stam Rabbi Shimon that says it's only going to be a tmur for the oila, but not for the other two, the pesach and the osham. The third opinion was this Rabbi Yehuda bar Rabbi Shimon that explains in the name of Rabbi Shimon differently, that he says Rabbi Shimon holds that none of the things will work to make a tmura. So now Gemara goes back to this and tries to bring a support first for the shita of Rabbi Shimon. Says the Gemara, and again Rabbi Shimon says that the tumor does not work for any of those offerings. Says the Gemara, Chavroi b'shem Rabbi Yochanan, the Bnei Yeshiva in the name of Rabbi Yochanan said the following: Rabbi Ivu Bar Nagri Omar Kume Rabbi Ila b'shem Rabbi Yochanan. Or Rabbi, also in addition, Rabbi Ivu Bar Nagri in front of Rabbi Ila also said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan the following: Taimo the Hain Tanya. The reason for this opinion of the way Rabbi Shimon Yehuda explains Rabbi Shimon again, that when one is mafrish a nekeva, it will not make tmura for any of the karbonos of his oila, his pesach, or his osham. So let's bring a support. What is the reason for that? It says in the brisa, it says in the pasuk, "Im kol behema tmeya asher lo yakrivu mimenu korban lahashem." The Gemara asks, "My Talmud learner tmeya." What is meant from tmeya? It can't refer to a tmeya behema. Ela afilu tmeya ba'oisei hashem. Rather, it means it's tamei in that category, in that shame. The kasha, the Gemara says, that's difficult, because if you're going to say that, whereby you're going to say it means that it's tmeya ba'oisei hashem, and therefore it excludes that which is a nekeva from being an oila, a pesach, or an asham, because all of those have to be a zochar. Then ask the Gemara, kasha b'dok siv vehemid veherich. It says in the pasuk regards to this, it says in the hemshech of the psukim that the animal has to be stood up and to be evaluated. And that, Rabbi Shimon says, is only true when it has kedushas haguf. So therefore, that can't be a possibility. Rabbi Zeir, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Elazar, loy omar kain. he said he did not say this, but rather, Elo vim kol behema tmei asher lo yakrivu mimena korban laHashem. The passage that we just quoted is learned differently. Kol she'ena ro'ui likarev, whatever is not fitting to be brought, loy kan v'loy b'mokom acher, not here and not in another place. Eino oiset tmura, where we know when it comes to a female in a keva, it could be brought in another makom. So therefore, yatzas nekeva lo oilo. Whereas the nekeva could be brought in another makom as a carbon oila, as an oif. So therefore that will then be not a support like we originally thought for the way Rabbi Shimon Yehuda explains Rabbi Shimon in the Brisa, but rather a support for the Stam Rabbi Shimon. The Stam Rabbi Shimon said that when one is mafrish a nekeva, it will be valid as a tmura for an oila. Not going to be valid for a Pesach or a Noshim, but for the oila it would be valid. So this supports that. On that, the Gemara challenges and asks Rabbi Avun v'Rabbi Bun, Rabbi Avun v'Rabbi Bun, Bon kumei Rabbi Zera. They asked before Rabbi Zeira on this drasha, Harei haroiveya v'hanirbo she'enan ru'ui lekarev loikan v'lo mokom acher v'harei ein oisin tmura. Behold, we know when it comes, it says to a roiveya and nirva, if the animal had relations with a man, sodomized a man, or a man was a victim of a man's sodomy, then those things are not going to be roy for a carbon, not here and not somewhere else. And yet, we have an explicit statement from the Mishnah that indeed a rovea and a nirba does make tmura. So that can't be therefore a valid way of explaining the pasuk. Omar loy, so he said to them in response, you're right, it's not a proof for the shita of Rabbi Shimon Stam, but rather like the Tanakama of the Mishnah. That means what? The Tanakam of the Mishnah is saying that it will be a tmura for all of those things, for an oila, for a Pesach, and a Osham. When I learned the pasuk, I did mean Tmeya Mamish. It means an animal that is not clean, an animal that is impure, a non-kosher animal. On that, the Gemara says, if it means a non-kosher animal, and therefore that's how you're learning, Vikashya. In the same way that we asked before, bedok si vehemi veherich. In regards to this parsha, it states that you're going to stand up the animal and you're going to have it evaluated. So we know when it comes to a behema dis tmeya, that's already stated in another verse. It's not necessarily over here. This verse is specifically talking about a behema that gets a mum. So therefore, if it's a behema that gets a mum, therefore it cannot be that which is going to then exclude the roveh and the nirva. Because the roveh and the nirva is included. And therefore, the Gemara leaves it as a kasha on Rabbi Zeira's statement that he said before. So you have no proof for any of these statements in the Brisa. The Mishnah now concludes the parak by speaking about the protocol, so to speak, of when Hekdesh would make a transaction with a vendor. And says the Mishnah, how would that work? Once in every 30 days they would set prices for the things that they would buy from their vendors. For example, the oil or the flour. And the Mishnah explains, anybody who accepts upon themselves as a vendor to then provide to the Hekdesh slotos, which is fine flour for 4, meaning for 4 saw. 1 sela can buy 4 saw. That's what they made up in the agreed upon price. Amdu mishalosh, but subsequently you can only buy 3 saw with 1 sela. Yisapek midalid. Still, the vendor has to provide more saw, 4 saw for the sela, not the lower price, the lower amount, the 3 saw for the sela. What about the opposite scenario? Says the Mishnah, Misholosh v'amdu midalid. If they originally made up that 1 seller would buy 3 saw, And then subsequently, it went to the point where you can buy 4 saw for 1 selah. Then Yisapik midalid. Then still the vendor has to provide the amount of dalid soim. Sheyad hekdesh alayir. Because the principle is that the yad of the hekdesh always has the upper hand. And therefore, in both scenarios, they will get the greater price. The Mishnah goes on to explain also, im hitlia soiles, if the flour became wormy, hatlia loy, then the vendor has to then absorb the loss. Vim hechmitz yayin, hechmitz loy. Similarly, if the wine becomes vinegar, then again the vendor has to absorb the loss. Eino mekabel mo'isov. Ad sheyeh hamizbeach meratze. Because the mizbeach, until the mizbeach itself has the flour on the altar, or the oil or the wine on the altar, it does not have the final transaction of the money until that point. And therefore, if something happens before that, thereby it will be absorbed by the vendor. The Gemara now brings a dissenting opinion to this last statement in the Mishnah. Tani, b'shem Rabbi Shimon. It was taught in the name of Rabbi Shimon. Miyad hayu mekabelin es ma'osehen v'hakayanim zrizinhen. It says immediately it would already then be considered to be an exchange of the money. Why? Because when it comes to these things like the flour or the wine, the kayanim is reason to ensure that they will not become worm-eaten, they will not become vinegar, and therefore the transaction was already made before, and if it does, according to Rabbi Shimon, then even the Beis HaMikdash would have to be soivel such a loss. Hadron Aloch, Perek Hatruma. The 5th Perek begins by explaining that there are various people who are involved in different things in the Beis HaMikdash, and as a result of their tzidkus, it is mentioned over here, listed in the Mishnah, 15 different people and their positions in the Beis HaMikdash. Says the Mishnah, these are the following who are considered to be held in charge in different areas in the Beis HaMikdash. Yochanan ben Pinchas ala Chaisamos. Yochanan ben Pinchas on the Chaisamos. These were the tokens that were then provided so that those who want the Nesachim will also then give their tokens so they can get the Nesachim. Achya ala Nesachim. Achya was important for the Nesachim, to be in charge of the Nesachim. Masya ben Shmuel ala Payosos. There was different lots that were taken for the avodah of the Kohanim, which is mentioned in the beginning of Masechet Yuma, and those lots were drawn and were put in charge by Masya ben Shmuel. Psachya ala Kainin. Psachya was in charge of the birds that were pairs, that were the Zov and the Zova, and the Yoledes would bring. Now the Mishnah takes a slight departure and explains who is this Pasya. Who is this Pasachya? Pasachya Zehu Mordechai. Pasachya was indeed Mordechai Hatzadik from the Purim story. Subsequent to the Purim story, he moved to Yerushalayim, to the Beis HaMikdash after the second Beis HaMikdash was built, and he was there in charge of the Kanim. Pasachya. Why was his name called Pasachya? Because things were opened up, and he would explain them, knowing also 70 different languages. When people would come and bring their various karbonos, and he would explain, he would understand what is their intention because he understood them. Ben Achya, the Mishnah continues, al hachad me'ayim. When it came to the Kohanim, they would have to eat a lot of meat because they didn't want noisar. So in order to eat the meat of the karbonos, they would develop very often intestinal problems, and therefore there was a doctor named Ben Achya who was in charge of them. Nechunya choife shichin. Nechunya who would dig those pits. That means they would make cisterns so that water would be provided for the Ole Regolim. Gevini karos. Gevini, he would announce the beginning of the day when it was time to then begin the avodah. Ben Gever al Ne'ilah Shorim. Ben Gever was in charge of the locking of the gates. Ben Bivai Mimuna al Hapakia. He was in charge. Some explain this is referring to that the Gemara in the Bavli explains this is referring to he was in charge of those whips. So if those people who were the guards fell asleep, he would whip them. Others explain is referring to not the whips, but rather Hapakia is the psilois that were used for the menorah. Ben Arza al Hatzilzel. Ben Arza would cling the cymbal by making the noise, indicating that it's time for the Shiras Halevim. Hugras ben Levi al Ashir. Hugras, who was himself a Levi, he would begin the Shir with the other Levim, and he would also end the Shir. So he would lead that. Beis Garmu al Maise Lechem Haponim. Beis Garmu, they were appointed for the Lechem Haponim, which had to be made in a special way, in a special shape, to stay fresh for the entire week, and then was changed from Shabbos on Shabbos with a new Lechem Haponim, 12 different showbreads that the Kohanim would ultimately then eat. Beis Avtinos al Maise Ketores. Beis Avtinos was appointed for the Maise Ketores, which was a complicated way of mixing the spices, not only pulverizing the spices, but also adding a special rare type of grass that would cause then the smoke to rise like a pillar and go straight up. The Elazar ala Paroiches. Elazar was appointed on the Paroiches, the curtains of the Beis HaMikdash. And finally, Upinchas ha-Malbish. Pinchas was appointed in charge of those Bigdei Kahuna to make sure that they were fitting the Kohanim in the proper way, and he was in charge of that as well.